Hello everyone and welcome to this Motor Trade Radio weekday special powered by Motors. I'm flying solo today because Philip's on a well-deserved holiday, and I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Derren Martin, Director of Valuations at CAP HPI, to talk about how trade values performed in November. Welcome back, Derren. The latest editorial is published, so as ever, plenty to talk about.
Hi, Curtis. Yeah, sorry, the editorial actually comes out on Tuesday, so it'll be published tomorrow when we publish our monthly values. So, but there's definitely plenty to talk about. We're obviously a live product. We've been trying to keep the industry abreast of what's been happening throughout the month by talking about the live values. But yeah, there is a movement down again this month, which is the same as the previous month. So there's a 4.2%. or nearly £800, £775 drop in values. And yeah, there is a realignment that has been going on in the trade market. I think at this point it's very important to stress how we work. I've been copping quite a lot of flack for what's been happening in the market. The way we work, we receive sold trade data from around 50 different sources, and that reflects cars being sold to thousands of dealers from various sources. So we've got it from auctions, from leasing companies, from finance houses, from rental companies, from other remarketers. We also receive retail data. That's retail advertised data, which is how a number of other businesses work on their valuation side as well. But we have the sold trade data, and that's what we've been using and analysing to reflect the market. It's a very much don't shoot the messenger, because the way we work, we are, as I say, reflecting what we see in the sold trade data. And although supply levels are high in the market, conversion rates are very low, or not very low, they've come down. They have actually gone up a little bit more in the last week or so, but that's off the back of cars being sold very cheaply. And as an example of looking at the actual raw data, not our valuations, but if you look at some of the raw data, there are certain sources, and this isn't any particular one source, but say auction sources, for example, clean cars going on average for just under 93% of cap. That's clean cars on average. Under 5 years old, that's around 92% of cap. And then there's contract hire and leasing companies, but the average percentage of cap is around 95% of cap. And that, again, is on clean cars. So this is what we're reflecting. That's the sold data. People ask us to be transparent with who our sources are. Unfortunately, there are things such as non-disclosure agreements that we have in place with them and contractual agreements. So I can't give the names of where we get our data from, but there are thousands and thousands of pieces of data that we receive and lots of different sources of that. And they are large companies, small companies, and across the board, and also retailers. So I just wanted to try and clarify that at the start.
Yeah, no, definitely worth doing there, Derren, because as we say every month, context is everything when we look at the trade values for the month. And I did notice you were getting a bit of flack on social media. And indeed, as we record this today, there was one publication that briefly described it as a price crash, this 4.2% drop. But I noticed that headline has been changed. And that I guess that's kind of unhelpful, isn't it, in terms of the market as a whole, describing the fall in such a way.
Yeah, I don't see it as a crash. I see it as a realignment. I see it as previous high prices kind of coming down to a different level because they were high, because there's lots of pressure on the market at the moment. It always comes down to supply and demand. Demand has dropped off. No retailers are stocking up in huge volumes. There are some that are now starting to look at the new year, and they are buying again. or they're buying in slightly higher volumes. But the main reason is that new car supply for 15 months now has been increasing, and those manufacturers are feeding the fleet and leasing industry in particular, which leads to more cars coming back into the market. So that's what's happening. But I do see it as a realignment, and it's important to stress as well that values are still, for petrol and diesel cars at least, still on average 15% ahead of where they were 3 or 4 years ago, before those big increases in 2021. So what's that, 2.5, 3 years ago?
Yeah, and I know most months you actually make the point that if you track CAP Live, you get to see the market, how it's fluctuating on a daily basis. So looking at November, how did the month actually track? How did it pan out? Because as the editorial points out, there was a lot of movement, pretty much on a daily basis.
Yeah, and it was a continuation of October. So we saw a 4.2% move in October. Throughout October, we saw the same figure actually, which coincidence, I guess, 4.2% in November as well. So that's on average. Some cars have been coming down a lot more than that, but it was evident really so we cut off for monthly subscribers around 5 days before the end of the month, and we published 3 working days before the end of the month. And you could already see before those monthly values were published that the values were already coming down. So when the market is dropping, and this hasn't happened for a long time, these kinds of movements down. Obviously, they went up similarly in 2021. It tends to happen all the way through the month. So every time we were looking at the data for specific models, the data was suggesting that we should put values down for most cars. Some stay level, some actually went up. I think there was some Dacia product that went up in value over the last month. But in general, there's a relatively significant movement down, and that's based off what cars are being sold for in the trade. And then for our retail value, we apply a margin to that trade value as a suggestion, a recommendation for what dealers could sell for if they buy at those trade values. So, but to answer your question, we saw it pretty much throughout the month, values coming down all the way through. And generally, every time we looked at it, they were slightly worse. And there are cars being sold for very low percentages of cap. Of course, if they're from a fleet or a leasing background, those cars, they were put on maybe 3 years ago, and that was before prices went up in 2021. So their residual value that they've placed on those cars is still a lot higher than what the current prices are for those cars. So they can afford to sell at a lower percentage of cap and move that volume on, which is what happens. That remarketers of vehicles will sell cars at what they feel is the market value at that time.
And we talk about context. Price drops in November are not actually that unusual. So how much of this 4.2% drop is seasonal, and how much is it part of this downward price realignment that we've been seeing since April?
It's difficult to apportion sort of different percentages to each of it, but yeah, you're right. Values tend to drop in November. We've seen movements of over 3% a number of times. It can also be quite stable. And last year it dropped by, I think, around 0.5% or something like that. So we actually had some strength at this time of year, but there wasn't so much supply there then. So there's no doubt that some of this movement is seasonal. It does generally happen as we move towards Christmas. People start to think about the festive period. There's winter fuel bills. There's obviously cost of living crisis at the moment. There are other things going on. So yeah, you've got the seasonal element, and then you've got the cost of living concerns around interest rates being high and negative equity in cars, and cars just being the cars they're looking to buy being more expensive, and people going and trying to get finance and not being able to get finance, or not being able to afford a deposit. If your mortgage has gone up by a few £100s, or even by 4 figures from people I've spoken to, are you going to go out and make an aspirational purchase for a vehicle? So the necessity purchase remains. The bottom end of the market remains relatively strong. but it's that top end and people we speak to, 15, 20 grand and up, that's where it's a lot more of a struggle. And yeah, that's based off seasonality, but also based off what's happening in the country at the moment.
And drilling into some of that data, Derren, what trends did you notice in terms of the different age bands?
So the values at 1 year, 10,000 miles dropped by 3.3%, compared to that 4.2% at 3 years old. But then at 10 years old, I guess a pointer to those cheaper cars, that only dropped by 2.6%. So that there's a lot smaller movement down. And to put that into context, at 10 years old, that's only £150. So and under £5,000 by value, that's only about £85 movement down. So you have to put it all into context. But at the 1 year point, yeah, it was over £1,000 average movement. So that more aspirational, more expensive end has been the worst affected.
And we always look at the different market segments as well. And I did notice it was a particularly tough month for SUVs. What do you think drove the falls that you saw there?
Yeah, well, SUVs, it's a very general term, isn't it now? Because I mean, what, 30, 40% of the market, maybe even more than that, are now SUVs, small SUVs to large SUVs. But part of that is down to volume. Plenty of those cars around. They're the ones that are coming back in the highest volume. So there's plenty of choice. And dealers aren't stocking up by as much as they have done previously. So if there's lots of the same type of vehicle out there, even not necessarily the same model, but same sort of size of vehicle, same fuel types, then they don't need to buy loads of them. They can just cherry pick the best ones, the best examples, the lower mileages, and that affects the values of the vehicles that aren't selling because just not quite so desirable maybe. So that's why that sector has been probably one of the hardest hit. But it's as I say, a generalisation for SUVs, and there's lots of different models that have moved in different directions there. Well, not different directions, but by different amounts. Some of them have been affected by sort of 11%. We've seen some product there that has been particularly hurt, but then there are other vehicles that have been hit by nowhere near as bad as that. Like Suzuki Jimny, for example, we've actually put some vehicles up in value there. So it can be very wide ranging what we see in the market.
And turning to fuel type, maybe if we talk about EVs in a moment, what did you see across petrol, diesel, and hybrids?
So the main story is that the whole market is coming down. Really, it's not that diesel cars are selling or petrol cars are selling. It's across the piece really. Petrol cars on average dropped by 4.3%, but obviously that's the largest sector. Diesel cars by 4%. Hybrids by similar amounts. So there's nothing really discerning in the fuel type there. Electric vehicles, always need to talk about electric vehicles at the moment. They actually for the third month in a row with the strongest performing fuel type, dropped by just 3.3% compared to that 4.2% average. But again, there's lots of different models moving by different amounts there. Not quite as much strength for the sort of the Zoes and the Leafs as there have been in previous months, but some pressure on some of the aspirational vehicles there. Cars like the iX1, Lexus UX, Mercedes EQB, they all came down by relatively significant amounts. Kia EV6 dropped by around 5% as well. And then also where there's been plenty of choice in the EV world. So Hyundai Kona came down 4%. The Kia e-Niro came down 3%. Again, that's slightly better than the average. The Model 3, we always talk about obviously Tesla product, that came down 4%. Although that looks reasonable value for money now, there's a lot of them around in the market. So that's what caused some value drops there. So lots going on. And as I said, the Zoe and the Leaf did also come down in the last month, whereas they actually went up last month. So a little bit more pressure on everything. But EV's the strongest performing fuel type.
And just staying with EVs briefly, you make a point in the editorial about some of the big discounting that you're observing in the new car market. How do you think that's going to feed into used sales over the next couple of months?
There's a lot of activity from manufacturers at the moment. There's a lot going on with them. You've obviously got to sort of feel for them a little bit with the ZEV mandate next year. 22% of cars having to be EVs, and that hadn't been announced particularly well or in a timely fashion by government. So there's plenty going on there, but their supply levels are getting back to normal. So they're having to, in a depressed market, they're looking to produce discounts in the retail world. They're sending cars into the sort of the fleet arena as well, and I would expect some pre-reg activity to happen. I think rental companies are getting more volume as well, although caveat on that is nowhere near back to previous levels. But there are lots of different ways to skin a cat, basically, and that's where the OEMs are now sort of sending some of those models, and it will be fascinating to see what happens next year with that when they do have to have such a high percentage of their vehicles sold as electric vehicles. It can have an effect on the used car market if you see heavy discounting.
Yeah.
Certainly, if you've got cars that are close to list or there's plenty of them around in that sort of late plate market, you're not going to pay more for a used car than you are for a new one. So there has to be a reasonable gap, and that's when you can see if you see discounting, that's when it can affect the values of used cars.
Yeah, definitely. Now, every month you poll the view of auction houses. What were they telling you about stock levels and demand compared to the previous month?
So stock levels for most volumes are declining. They're not particularly they're not particularly overstocked at the moment, but with conversion rates at around 50 or 60%, they do have plenty of cars, but not overstocked, I would say. But there are a lot of cars that are swilling around and not selling. You can see that by the conversion rates, and the feedback from the auction houses on conversion rates was that they had decreased for almost 70% of respondents said that their conversion rates were decreasing. A very, very small percentage saying they were increasing. And again, most were saying that demand had dropped. So we do expect that to uptick a little bit now, as I said earlier, with dealers stocking up for hopefully an improvement in retail demand in January or even from Boxing Day. And we do think that will happen. We do think there will be an uptick in consumer demand, and that might stop some of these trade values going through to the retail market. If dealers can hold on price in anticipation of a January sort of improvement, then we may not see retail falling down by as much as trade has dropped by. But there's different things going on in that retail world as well, with some dealers reducing prices, some not reducing prices, and some obviously now buying cars cheaper and being able to advertise them cheaper. But overall, the auctions are, I think they're very honest assessment of what's happening in the market. They know it's tough, but we do have to be careful that we don't just talk ourselves into a sort of a poor situation. Things like this happen, and we always come out of them.
And I know you talk to a lot of dealers over the course of the month, so just wondering what anecdotally the sort of feedback you're getting from dealers that you've been talking to over the course of November. How's business performing for them?
They're okay. It's, as I say, it's dropped because of demand has dropped because of sort of the seasonal feel to the market and other things that are going on with people's finances. But demand is still there. They are still selling cars, but they're just not stocking up, and they're not selling them in as much volume as they would probably like to. But yeah, we speak to loads of dealers through the month. They understand what's happening. They see the prices that are happening in the trade market. And as I say, there's different schools of thought. There are those that have bought previously at high prices, so they're trying to keep those prices high. Keep an eye on January, and hopefully it will all come back then. There are others that are tweaking prices down, and that is definitely happening in the retail world. Obviously, there's different ways to do your pricing. We're a guide, and we're a guide mainly for trade values and to see where to set that retail. I know there are companies that are having their own webinars about how what we do and whether it's the right thing to do. But as I say, we are we are a guide, and it's for the retailers to decide how they price their vehicles. And they are obviously experts in their own stock, but we're there to help and guide and to discuss if and when anybody wants to talk to us about it, rather than having an abusive discussion on LinkedIn.
I'm sure they don't go on, Derren. Now, looking at December, you've highlighted that really from Boxing Day. I mean, we see this, and I know Motors have done research on this in the past. This Boxing Day bounce where consumers, car buyers, they've pretty much got Christmas out of the way. They're looking to the future. They're looking at possibly replacing their cars. So how do you think prices will perform in December, which after all is traditionally a quiet month for the sector?
Yeah, I think does tend to be a bounce. A lot of people do log on Boxing Day. They're bored of the mother-in-law and they've decided that they're going to get back in and look for a vehicle again. So we do think it will improve, definitely, and it could, and hopefully it will improve as early as that. I guess a lot of people are talking to us about, is there going to be a January bounce? The actual January bounce in values is unlikely because there's so much volume out in the market still that all of those cars that haven't sold will still be swilling around. And as I said earlier, there'll be manufacturer activity at the end of the year, which could generate pre-registered cars. It will generate some swappers into the market as well. So demand will hopefully come back. We do honestly think that will happen. I think it might be a little while before we see that, meaning values go back up, but they will probably come down by less than they are coming down by at the moment. We certainly see that through December. I think there will be small movements down still, reflected in our live product, but we do think that it won't be as severe as this month.
So you're sounding fairly sort of reasonably upbeat for January.
Yeah, I think January. There's been people who have been putting off a purchase, but they generally will come back into the market. I think January dealers will be busy. As I say, I don't think values will go up, and we might see a couple of months of that. But there could be sort of a longish bottom to this valuations being down there, and we do see next year as being quite a positive year overall. There's 2.5 million less cars in the market, so that has to have an impact. And at the moment, we see cars realigning in price back down to a more reasonable level, and they do start to look good value now. So yeah, we're upbeat about how January will be, but we're obviously a few weeks away from that at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see what happens over that period.
Well, Derren, many thanks for that roundup of the November editorial, which, as you say, is available from Tuesday this week. That's on the caphpi.com website. That's cap-hpi.com. You can look at the full editorial there and download it. So once again, Derren, many thanks for coming on. Good to catch up with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Curtis. And yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to us, we're more than happy to have conversations with anybody. I can put editors in charge with the dealers. We know it's tough out there at the moment. We are reflecting what we see, what we analyse. But if anybody wants to talk to us about anything to do with the market, please reach out to me.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's all for this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast powered by Motors. Philip and I are back with the headlines this weekend. Until then, it's goodbye from me and many thanks for tuning in.